Hi all, I'm Scott Rogers, and I'm looking forward to spending a little time with you all in about a week where we'll delve into mindfulness and how mindfulness and mindfulness practices and insights into the nature of the activity of the mind and attention in particular can be helpful for bolstering our focus and our performance and productivity, especially during high stress intervals or high stress periods of time, something that we might call VUCA. A term that draws from the military, where the idea is that there are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous periods where really being able to marshal our resources, that which we know, that which we've prepared for, during these moments of high stress can be especially helpful and relevant. And I'm looking forward to our conversation, and for some of you, perhaps continuing a conversation that was begun when I met with some of you about 3 years ago. I'm assuming that for many of you, mindfulness is new or new enough that I'm not going to make any assumptions about what you know. And at the same time, we'll, in our time together, and with this introduction sort of setting us up, go into some pretty relevant and applicable places when we do meet. In light of that, what I would request is, if you would like to, please let Ursula know of a question or a scenario where you would be interested in us exploring when we do talk, how the subject matter would be relevant and applicable with tips or insights around its application. So I'll look forward to perhaps receiving some questions or some scenarios where you'd like me to reflect on so that I can share with you the application of mindfulness and mindfulness practices in those domains. Also, you'll find a one-pager that has 2 sides called The Landscape of the Mind, which you'll get in advance of our meeting, and we'll look at it together when we do meet. But in advance of that, I think that you will find that the landscape of the mind, also known as the attractive nuisance image, is very useful for our discussion and can be useful moving forward for you to have handy and to periodically look at. We'll explore when we're together why that is, but in advance of that, I would be grateful if you would just look it over and consider 2 things. One, what are some places that you know that you go to from time to time that don't necessarily lead to or support strong focus and optimal performance? And secondly, if you don't see certain places on the landscape of the mind, I created about 15 years ago based on my own experience, write in what it would be. And so when we do meet, you can let me know of some places that you know that I overlooked or maybe am not as aware of as you. And we can explore that as well. So with that, you also have some readings. And I wanted to give you just a little sense of what these readings are orienting towards, because there's a lot of them, and you'll pick and choose maybe what's of interest to you. One of them is a piece that I wrote back in, I think, 2014 for the Louisiana State Bar Journal called "What Do We Want? Mindfulness in Law." And it's an early, that is in time of the integration of mindfulness or its infusion into the legal profession, discussion very generally of what mindfulness is, what mindfulness practices are, in particular a practice known as focused attention. And I'll close our time together in this video with a short focused attention practice that you can do with me and perhaps may want to do periodically leading up to our time together, because one of the things that we can talk about is what did you notice, or what was it like as you began to implement this short practice into your daily routine, if you'd be interested in doing so, or perhaps you have in the past and it reminds you to, oh yes, and let me do this again. And so this piece, What Do We Want? Mindfulness in Law, gives you that overview of that practice, gives you a little bit of insight into why that practice is helpful, and I think you'll enjoy the piece. It's a relatively short piece. Another is a piece that I wrote with a colleague, a federal judge, Chris McLilley, now retired, and Amishi Jha, a cognitive neuroscientist. And Amishi and I have been doing cognitive neuroscience research on the efficacy of mindfulness practices in high stress, high consequence environments for the last 12 years. And among the pieces that we've published in that regard, I've included some in the packet of readings for those of you who might just be interested in a little bit of the science of mindfulness and mindfulness practices. But this piece we wrote for judges on mind wandering and the development of cognitive resilience. And I think that you'll find that it gives you a nice little taste of the science in a very easy to digest form, that it's crafted for judges. Of course, so much of the underlying capacities and qualities that we want to bring to the work that we're doing is the same. So you'll find it, I think, to be very relevant and applicable to you. Another piece, a very short piece, just about 2 pages, was written by Paul Singerman. Paul Singerman is an extraordinary business law attorney and trial attorney. And the piece that was published in the Florida Bar Journal, in an edition that came out about 8 years ago on mindfulness, it was a special issue on mindfulness, is called The Return on Investment from the Study and Practice of Mindfulness, where Paul really offers you, I think, some interesting insights into just how important it is to pay attention and what he began to realize about his paying attention when he began to practice mindfulness, and in particular, the focused attention practice that is written about in the first piece, and I'll close with today, that we'll practice together, and it really is one of the more popular and common mindfulness practices. A piece by Judy Cohen, a colleague, zeroes in on mindfulness in conflict and how mindfulness can be helpful when we are, as she refers to it, surrounded by conflict. And it's written very much with the attorney and the trial attorney in mind. Another piece was published a handful of years ago in the American Bar Association that I penned on mindfulness and negotiation, and in particular a variation on the word negotiation, negotiation, which is where we find ourselves, whether we realize it or not, negotiating with ourselves. And that's something that's also relevant to our conversation. The 2 more science-driven pieces are, one, a piece that came out of the lab, Mishi's lab, where we do a lot of the neuroscience research, and this was published in a chapter in a book, so it's not science-heavy, on strengthening attention and mindfulness training in workplace settings. So I think that if you should find that topic of interest, you'll find it's some of that content to be relevant and helpful. And then lastly, there's a piece that I wrote, Amishi and I wrote with a general in the Army, that's specifically on the way the Army and the military is interested in mindfulness. It's titled Deploying Mindfulness to Gain Cognitive Advantage, Considerations for Military Effectiveness and Well-Being. So this idea of being able to bring together our well-being as well as our performance in the most challenging and stressful of situations is really front and center. I think it's front and center in a different context and perhaps at times with different consequences, but not necessarily with any less of a sense of the stressfulness and the way that stress can impinge on us, and can, in that impingement, if we're not skillful in relating to it or doing something in response to it, it can affect that which we wish to bring to bear in those moments, whether it's focus and concentration, whether it's creative thinking, whether it's the ability to listen, whether it's the ability to sort of put pen to paper and quickly come up with a game plan or a revisiting of a game plan because of new information that's found, and or the way we interact with and treat other people. So I hope that overview of the readings that you have is helpful to give you a sense of what it is that you might want to zero in on now, between now and the time we meet, or really any time thereafter. All right, so now with that, I thought I could say a little bit about where we're going to go content-wise when we meet, in addition to looking over the landscape of the mind image. And by the way, on the back of that image is a list of some of the science findings that I think you would find interesting and relevant on mindfulness. We can discuss that when we meet, although it's really just meant to provide you with a sense of the domains that could be surprising in terms of the practice of mindfulness. Domains such as changing and influencing the structure and function of the brain. That's pretty interesting and surprising to many, and many years ago, say 20 or 30, would have really been anathema to what was even thought possible. And now we know differently, and that's something known as neuroplasticity, the way our brain is continually changing in response to our experience. And so when we practice mindfulness in particular, we could say that we are engaging in self-directed neuroplasticity, where the changes that can emerge in areas associated with executive function and decision making, as well as the ability to regulate emotions, becomes particularly relevant to us. And then other areas from the physical health domain to our emotional health and well-being, attenuation of anxiety, modifications to our mood and fluctuation. So it's crafted in a way that you can see pieces that might be relevant to you from a variety of different domains, and they come from a online publication known as Science Daily, which takes these primary publications and source materials and then comes up with a 1 or a 2 pager so that you can read and get the gist of it. Ultimately, you'd want to look to the primary source, as you know, in so many other areas, because people might not give it the full treatment or overlook things to make the point that they want to make in what they're writing. But I think you'll find that it's true enough to and serious enough a publication that they're worthwhile and they're informative. All right, so part of what we'll be exploring is how it is that we can have a practice for the long game, so that as we move into the moments of our life and we move into one professional experience after the other, in the office, with colleagues, with clients, in court, with opposing counsel and counterparties, as we move through these again and again and again, that we can emerge increasingly resilient and a little bit more less resistant to the things that are coming at us that might be surprises or unpleasant or undesirable. Of course, that happens with experience, just as a matter of course. It happens when we're working with, people who are skilled and who we can learn from and who model that. And also we can, through mindfulness practices, really inoculate ourselves so that we are more prepared for those moments. And in particular, as I indicated a moment ago, because we're resisting less and moving into a little bit more confidently what's happening. And the reason why we're able to do that, and this is important, and this is what we'll zero in on, is because our attention has been trained so that in those moments, the very quick assumptions and preconceptions and judgments that just begin to arise based on our conditioning and our prior experience are less likely to catch us unaware and catapult us into emotional states and decisions that we make and things that we say or don't say that don't serve our interests or our clients' interests as well as we could have. So part of it is that we have practices and considerations for the long game that are helping to create a more enduring, strengthened, mindful way of relating to our experiences and getting work done in and of itself. We'll also learn practices that are more for the short term, more for when there's an acute stressor, we could say, that arises. It could be in those moments that we've prepared for, but nonetheless, there's a saying, no plan survives the enemy. We're at times going to be thrown off a bit, and so how do we quickly recalibrate? And but then during the day, just things will happen, and we will begin to feel anxious, or we'll begin to have a sense of lethargy that sort of takes over us, in part because we've been putting in so much concerted effort and focus, more so than perhaps was necessary to get the work done, sort of this hypervigilant state. And so how is it, in particular when we're feeling that high stress, anxious way, what we can do in those moments as a more short form relief? And to have this be as helpful as possible, we'll look to how it is that we can draw upon very similar types of practices and objects of attention to be able to bring about those meaningful shifts. So let us close with a short mindfulness practice. It'll begin with a few slower, deeper breaths. That's something that we'll explore and we'll talk about. It's not the mindfulness practice part, but it is useful for helping to establish the state of mind and body that can allow us to engage in the practice in a little more long-term way, perhaps, and to get more out of it. And then it will move to focusing on the breath as the object of attention for this particular practice. And this is what's talked about in a couple of the different articles, so that if you read one or more, you'll come across this. We'll talk about the utility of this and why it is that those science findings emerge from a practice as straightforward as this when done on a fairly regular basis, but not necessarily for extended periods of time. And so with that, I welcome you to bring yourself into a seated posture that is upright and stable, comfortable, aware of the posture, not sitting rigid, but also not slouched. And if it's comfortable, this will be a 3-minute practice. If it's comfortable enough to support your posture without leaning back, if the chair is constructed in such a way that that doesn't put undue pressure on your back, you might want to do that, because we're really interested in being intentional, being deliberate, and sort of waking up, we could say. And so with that, we can lower or close our eyes, whichever you prefer, or look down with a soft gaze. And eyes could also be wide open, looking straight ahead. It sometimes can be helpful to lower or close the eyes if we're interested in having a slightly more relaxed experience, and also because we are turning our attention inward, and so there's less visual stimulation. But the practice of mindfulness and being mindfully aware and developing our capacity to be even more mindful moment by moment is independent of whether our eyes are opened or closed. But this is a training. This is a training in attention. Aware of the body and of where the body makes contact with the chair beneath you, perhaps behind you, as we breathe. Attending to the sensations of the hands and fingers resting one in the other, or on your lap, or by your side. And because it can be helpful for feeling a little more relaxed, a little less stressed at times, to take a few slower, deeper breaths. Let's take 3 slower, deeper breaths as we breathe in. And out. Breathing in a little more fully, a little more deeply than we normally do, just a little. Comfortable, always comfortable. And exhaling, a slower, steadier, tempered out breath. Breathing in, and breathing out. And when we meet, we'll talk about why it is that slowing down the breath in this way can be helpful for attention, steadying, for relaxation. And I'll share with you a variety of different types of practices so that you may find one in particular that resonates with you. Now, though, we're no longer manipulating the breath to feel a certain way, or potentially to feel a little bit more relaxed. but rather resting attention on the sensations of the breath as it naturally flows. The mind will wander. That's inevitable. That's what Paul Singerman's piece speaks to, among the others. So importantly, you're not trying to stop your mind from wandering. That's really a fool's errand, if you understand the nature of the mind. But we do have the ability to notice when the mind wanders, and that's what this practice is helping to develop, the noticing. And so when in the next little bit of time you notice that your mind does wander away from the breath, gently return your attention to the breath. The gift is in the noticing. The skill is in the returning. The wandering is just going to happen as a matter of course, the nature of the mind. Returning to the breath, aware of the posture. And when you're ready, in the next moment or two, with an awareness of doing so, lifting the gaze, opening the eyes as we close this period of practice, this focused attention practice. All right, for now, and until we meet, you may wish to practice this practice a handful of times, just to sort of get into the swing of it and to have a sense of its pieces. A few slower, deeper breaths to bring about a little bit more of a relaxed state. You can do that anytime. It's a good idea. Focusing, noticing, returning. That's what that practice is. Focusing, noticing, and returning. All right, with that, I wish you all well, and I very much am looking forward to seeing you and interacting and discussing mindfulness with you soon.